90 days ago, I had 7% more equity in this property than I do now. And that's going to take quite a bit for me to kind of come down off my high horse, if you know what I mean.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right, welcome back, Freedom Point podcast listeners. Thanks again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. Appreciate you being here. I'm your host, Jeremey Dyer. Today, I have a wonderful guest with me, Peter Eberhardt. Peter is a semi-pro, get this, a semi-pro BMX racer. He's also an Uber driver on the side, real estate multifamily entrepreneur, and is an expert at becoming your desired self. Peter, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you for having me on. That was quite the intro there, but yeah, I guess I do a lot of things and wear a lot of hats.
Well, I feel like I owe it to my children to make sure that they have an opportunity to listen into this recording or this episode, because both I've got three boys and a daughter, and specifically my boys, at certain points in their childhood journeys have wanted to be BMX bike racers.
No
So
way.
please tell us a little bit more about that journey.
Well, so man, I guess I was always riding my bike around the neighborhood, right? Love to just be on it. Don't know where that hobby came from early on, but I basically I bugged my mom to look in to see if there was something that was more like organized. I would watch my friends go to soccer practice, baseball practice, what have you. I had no idea that BMX racing existed. No idea. And I would just be like, "Hey, can you find a place for me to go ride my bike with other people?" Like that was sort of what I would say. And turns out there was a local BMX track a few miles away from me in my old hometown. Went there, just randomly drove in and just so happened to meet the track operator there and found out when and where to come. So I came that next practice day and I just knew from the very first time I got on that gate, I have this very vivid memory of like, this is it. Like, this is me. And I just love doing it. And I hadn't even taken my first gate yet. So yeah, I raced for 15 years in total. 7 of those were semi-pro competitive, or, on the national level. And I would not trade that young life of mine in BMX for the world. Absolutely not.
Did you break any bones?
Nope. Nope. My worst injury was a complete tear on my PCL on my left leg, which was kind of a freak accident going into turn one on a practice night. But yeah, all my broken bones have come from other stuff not related to BMX. So BMX and just to be clear, we're talking about motocross racing or bicycle motocross racing, not the skate park freestyle. I got a lot more injuries in the skate park just messing around than I did on the track. So I had to make a decision to just drop the skate and the street side of things and just focus on the race side of things.
Yeah, no, that's great. I live up in Minnesota, and it's a pretty popular sport here.
Yeah.
And my children are all very much involved in the hockey scene, and so I would say that I've probably steered them away from BMX, bike racing, just because I've heard of the horror stories of people getting injured and so forth. But I've also heard a rumor, and maybe you can help me dispel this or affirm this, but BMX bike racing is one of the most physically demanding sports out of all of them.
Well, I haven't played all the sports like competitively, but I could absolutely say yes because it is a very focused 30 to 45 seconds of all out, but it's also an endurance type of thing where if you're racing for an entire weekend, so you're doing 8 to 10 laps a day, And then obviously you're practicing for hours on end. And that's just on the track. Off the track, you have all of the physical stuff. But yeah, I hear like actual motocross racing is brutal because it beats up your body. NASCAR driving is also pretty brutal just because of the conditions you go through. But yeah, from like a power output standpoint, because that's what we're all focused on is power output. But you're also maneuvering your entire body and core to get over these obstacles as fast as possible. So yeah, it's definitely high intensity. I don't know about the most exertion, but the intensity is like it's seriously up there. Mountain biking, road biking, yeah, you're low intensity for a longer period of time. This is a shorter period of time, the most extreme intensity you've ever probably experienced.
Right. Kind of reminds me of the difference between maybe somebody who's a sprinter versus a long distance marathon runner.
Exactly, exactly, precisely like that. Yeah, the tracks are very short, right? Even the longest tracks you can get around in under a minute. But you're sprinting, so you're going from point A to point B as fast as possible, and that's pretty taxing on both the central nervous system and the physical body.
So you had quite a decorated background, being a BMX bike racer, having the opportunity to train at the Olympic Training Center. Peter's not going to get into kind of all those details because the point of Peter being with us today is to talk a little bit more about that kind of journey, from being a BMX bike racer and transitioning into, the real estate world. And we talked a little bit off of the show here before we got started, and Peter's got some background in actively managing real estate and wants to continue to expand that portfolio. So can you talk to us about that transition from BMX bike racing into being an entrepreneur in the multifamily real estate space?
Yeah, that transition, it definitely wasn't an overnight transition. It wasn't a black and white transition. It was more of a trying to find myself and my identity and what matters to me transition, I would say. Funny enough, my real estate journey came from my BMX journey in a loose kind of connection because I grew up in Northern California. I moved down to San Diego when I was 18 to give myself the opportunity to get to where I wanted to be in the sport. And very quickly, I realized that if I wanted to train more, I needed to work less and make more money, but I couldn't make more money because that would require me to work more, right? So, very frustrating cycle I found myself in very quickly. So, I said, "Hey, I'm going to buy my own house and my roommates are going to pay for my rent so I can race more." Like that was my goal. And so I picked up Uber driving. I went all out on that. I got from my 20 grand in credit card debt that I had acquired from racing and saved up 30 grand in about 8 months. And, and I did that to buy my first condo in San Diego. At the time, I started with the intention of buying a 3 bedroom. I ended up only being able to get a 2 bedroom, so I was still paying the same amount in rent as my half of the mortgage after my roommate moved in. So I was pretty bummed about that. I was actually really pissed off, to be honest with you, because I felt that I had just wasted 6 months of 8 months of my life and not racing. So, anyways, I went back to racing. I got my national ranking. And then there was actually, I guess, one pivotal moment in what got me into real estate was I'm coming home late one night driving Uber. It's probably 10 o'clock at night. Okay. And which, by the way, is a very early night to end on Uber. So this must have had to have been a weekday. And my neighbors have all of their stuff just out in the common areas. And I said, hey, what's going on? They're like, oh, we're moving to Oklahoma. And I was very inquisitive. I was like, right now, like it's 10 o'clock at night. She's like, yep, husband's getting the U-Haul truck. We're going to be out of here tonight, and we're packing up tonight. We'll be out of here by tomorrow morning. So I'm like, all right, well, let me help you. So I'm helping him load this U-Haul, right? And I'm super nosy. So I'm like, yeah, so what are you selling your place for? It's directly across the hall from me, a 2-1 identical layout, with identical finishings. And she gave me a number that was about $70,000 more than what I had bought my place for 3 years prior. I just thought that that was the most BS thing I'd ever heard. So I laughed it off. But I checked into it that night, and sure enough, I was like, "Holy cow!" That was my light bulb moment where I knew that something was there that I needed to learn about and get into so that I could race my bike more, because that was obviously way more money than I could make, doing a regular job. So that was the pivotal moment. So from then I went full on in, consumed myself in learning. I think it was about 7 months later, I closed on a fourplex that was about 8 hours away from me. But in between that journey, I flew to Ohio. I went, I was going to buy single family homes out of state. That did, that made no sense to me. So came back and got that 4 unit in California. So that was my first like transition. And about the same time, I realized how burned out I was from BMX. I hung up my bike, and that was, I think, about the same time COVID hit. So we all knew that COVID was going to last a few weeks or a few months, right? So I hung up the bike, canceled all my races, or they got canceled for me, and I was like, yeah, I'll return to this at some point, and I just never returned. So I later on in retrospect, I was burning myself out because I was so intense to get to where I wanted to be, and just burned myself out in the process. Lost the love of it.
You kind of pivoted away from, a passion that you had onto now deflecting onto a new passion. Have you read the book Vivid Visions before?
Vivid Visions. I haven't even heard of that one. Who's the author?
Okay. Yeah, based on what you were kind of telling me and that transition that you made from, kind of your love of BMX, racing, transitioning then into, getting into real estate and kind of submerging yourself in that business. I'm sure you read a lot of books, listened to
Yeah.
podcasts, sought out mentors, basically learned the business, right? But the idea behind that transition was is you had to recalibrate, right? You had to, refocus your mindset, but you also had to have a vision, right? You had to have clarity of that vision and you had to focus on what that next thing was going to be. And so, based on kind of what you were explaining to me, it sounded a lot like, some of the lessons that I learned out of reading that book.
It may sound like that, but it was actually completely the opposite because I had just very recently gotten to the point where I have a little bit more of a repurpose identity, that vision, all of that. From the transition from even before I stopped racing to when I was kind of getting burned out, because I reached my goal in racing about, I wanted to say 6 months before I stopped racing. So I had already gotten my goal. And then after that, I'm like, okay, well, what's next? Okay, I got this goal. I got my national ranking. Then I transitioned to becoming just the best rider I could become, right? But it was a little bit different. So I was already starting to get checked out. And I left racing with no identity, no friends. My entire community in life was kind of encapsulated in that. And so, between a lot of work with my therapist, shout out to my therapist, I love her to death. She's really great. Um, we started to work through all these things, and I actually ended a relationship about the same time. So there was a period of my life where I really slipped away into workaholism. Like I would use work as an escape because I was a very unhappy, um, very miserable person. And it took quite a bit of effort to really, I guess, figure myself out and, yeah, try to find that vision and that clarity. Because once I had that and it all started to sort of come together, it was insane. My energy, my productivity, my sense of purpose. But it was about a 2 year transition from being a very happy BMX racer to being a very happy real estate investor.
So, how did you overcome this workaholism, right? Because I think we all have a tendency to slip into that. I guess we could almost call it an addiction to a certain, point, right? It releases endorphins and, depending upon what we're doing, obviously. But, for some people, it can be a deflection from the reality of maybe being a parent or being a husband or a wife or a boyfriend or whatever, right? How were you able to break free from that?
If I were to sum it up in one answer, I would say repetition with the determination to become the person I wanted to be. And it took time. I just knew that I wanted to be a person that didn't have trust issues, that had healthy relationships, that showed up for the people I cared about, that I mattered to different people. And starting with nothing, especially like in your late 20s, was a very weird, confusing thing because I would look around me and I would look at all my peers having a good time, being able to enjoy each other's company on a Sunday afternoon, and wanting that so bad, but not being able to have it because my mind was like, no, you need to be going to make money because this lifestyle that you want to live, whatever it looks like, you can't live that until you do this in life, right? Like you have to do this before you can do that. Something that I would always struggle with. And that's kind of what I bought into, hence the workaholism and exactly what you said. You are right because I didn't have the college life. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't party. So being in the Uber scene where everyone's just having a good time, alcohol's flowing, I'm driving and I love to just rip gears all night, music's going, money's coming in. It's a lot of stimulus, right? And it was so addicting to me. I mean, I would drive all the time and I loved it. I mean, I genuinely loved it, but I did start to notice that I was on inner very unhappy and I was very miserable. So, yeah, to sum it up, it was definitely a transition and constantly every little aspect of my life, physical, spiritual, personal, mental, all of these little things had a lot of things missing from them. And it took about 2 years for me to kind of put it all together, if that makes sense, and have them all work together to now the obviously I still have a lot of work to do. But the other thing of that was so all these cliche sayings work life balance or, life is short or all these things that would piss me off because they didn't help me. And I was honestly, Jeremy, I was like crying out for help. I bought my condo. Everyone is just congratulating me through the moon. I bought my 4 unit. Everyone's thinking, oh, it's such a good job. And I was like, guys, I need help. Like, I know it seems to you that I'm successful, but I am so miserable and I don't want to do this. Like I don't want to be here in this world if this is what life is. I don't know how to enjoy life. Literally did not. And so I think in addition to what I said about just that time to becoming the person I wanted to be, because I didn't know who I was, right? Again, cliche saying, just be yourself. Hate that saying. So I don't know who I am, but I know who I want to become. So I'm going to be that person. So it came down to a minute by minute in my day, every thought I had, every action, every single thing contributed to being that person I wanted to become. So if I didn't want to have the thought of like, oh, I need to do this to work, like I can't enjoy my time with this person because I need to go work. I needed to, be aware of that. So awareness, and then kind of the nail in the coffin was when I was finally able to grasp time and the movement of time and the passing of time and and just the thought of like getting to a certain point and knowing that it doesn't matter. You buy that 4 unit, you buy that car, you're going to buy the 20 unit. We got so far, but it doesn't really matter, right? That old Linkin Park song. That really drove home all the little things that I've been working on over the last 2 years. And from there, it was like a real quick transition of like, okay, now I'm still a hard worker, but I have my purpose, I have my sense, and I spend way more effort on the things that now matter, my people in my life. Which was a very seamless transition. And so it's definitely not a one size fits all, but yeah, to directly answer your question, to sum it up, becoming the person you want to become and awareness and a whole lot of dedication and you'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously having a purpose and living out that purpose and identity, and establishing, what that entails in terms of your identity as an individual, and do you want to become a daily better version of yourself, or are you comfortable being the same Peter that you always were? But I had this conversation with my teenage son over the weekend, and that is, we're all kind of created with a void, right? And that void gets filled with something, okay, and usually a lot of different things. And at some points during the course of your life, as you grow up and you grow older, it's time to, remove some of those things that are filling up that void and replacing them with other things that are maybe more productive, or maybe things that you enjoy doing more, or maybe give you a greater sense of accomplishment, or certainly purpose in life.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is some truth to that. My high performance coach, he once said that a lot of our energy and our purpose and our vision comes from past trauma. Like we all have trauma at some degree, and it doesn't matter if other people think it's trauma or not, because if it's trauma to us, it's trauma, right? And that will typically drive our passion. That will be our purpose, because if we can help other people, people we care about, or complete strangers, not to go through that trauma, then that's purpose right there. For me, the trauma was not having the money to follow my dreams. I thought it was so dumb that a little thing like money is going to hold me back from riding my bike. And I can't imagine all these other people, especially with the misguided information with it when it comes to financial education and what have you. But that's a whole separate side story. But if I can, because I had a very brief moment where I had a full ride sponsor. He paid for everything: races, events, travel, you name it. And it was the most insane, change shift in my training and my writing. And so, in the back of my head, I'm like, man, if I can get to a point where I can support younger kids that maybe they don't have the resources to follow their dreams, and they're solid people, like I don't, I just imagine how much more productivity and less problems the world would have if it wasn't for finances.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because based on this conversation, I'm coming away with you being an entrepreneur in the real estate space, specifically multifamily. You maybe consider yourself to be a rookie in that space. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, given that fact, what's kind of the next thing, that you want to accomplish as a real estate investor? Maybe both on the active side and perhaps maybe even on the passive side of investing in real estate.
Well, I would say my first thing right now is just to find a deal. I mean, I think that's what we're all searching for, but man, it's definitely tough in this particular cycle of the market. But I think to broaden that out a little bit, because living in California, we obviously have a very high ticket to entry, and we have a lot of red tape. In the operations of my 4 unit, I was able to navigate a lot of that red tape and get comfortable with it. So that part doesn't scare me whatsoever. But the high ticket to entry and the fact that a lot of bigger hedge funds and institutional investors park their money here, even in tired assets, it makes it a little tough. And so I think that I personally still struggle with this idea of I'm a backyards, boots on the ground operator, and that's what I love to do. But man, it would be easier in some degree to be going out of state. So I do kind of track a few different markets, and through my mastermind groups, I do have connections in other markets that, what, if a good deal came up that I wanted to go for in a market that was not near me, I would go for it and try it and see. So I would be a lot more content with a journey forward once I've kind of done away with that indecisiveness. So that's like more on the active side, would be to just do my next five and up deal, and operate it and exit it successfully. On the passive side, I don't really think I have any goals. I mean, because I know that I'm going to get there. I know that I'm going to be able to live the lifestyle that I want, which that changes every day. And I've already had that taste of financial freedom and consider myself pretty financially independent as it is. So, yeah, like if you're looking for a number, I don't have one.
Yeah, no worries. A lot of people's journeys into real estate, start off on the active side, and then they may transition, more into the passive side,
Yep.
as they, continue to build up, their portfolio, and maybe they have less time, actively involved in the management, of the business itself. And as a direct result of that, they want to spend more time doing the things that they enjoy and love to do outside of an occupation. And so a lot of times those active, investors, make that transition over onto the passive side. Question for you, as it relates to, your market being in California, what would you say are one of the, top one or two challenges that you're seeing on the underwriting side as to why a deal doesn't quite pencil out right now? Like what in the current market cycle that we're in, obviously debt, is a big concern. But outside of debt, are there any other areas in the underwriting process that you're coming to the conclusion that, this deal that you've underwritten just isn't going to make sense? It's not going to pencil out.
Well, there are a few factors. Yeah, that's a big one. Insurance is a big one. For me, actually, insurance hasn't been that big of an issue, even with the much older asset classes. I've been able to find or at least get verbal quotes from companies that say, yes, we will insure this given that these things are in place. But here in California, we really battle the obsolete economic rents quite a bit. For my aforementioned, having all of this institutional money here in California that they basically just park their money in these tired assets and they don't do anything, both operationally and physically, to the property. So it makes it all the more challenging to get that debt on them. But and we're still living in a little bit of an inflated bubble from a few years ago. But I'm seeing more and more sellers start to come around, and it makes it easier for us buyers. I mean, I'm tracking every single property to the T and following up every week to say, hey, this isn't under contract yet. Why? Do you want to accept my offer that's 30% below your asking? Because it's a good offer. And it seems like that you need a buyer for it. So as like a whole, when you're underwriting these properties and when you're underwriting in California, it's not so much the initial buy and the initial exit that's the problem. It's the in between. It's the operations of like, hey, how much risk are we going to take on to get these tenants to relocate, even with all of the red tape? And once that's done, new tenants are easy. But it's more so because, and there's a little bit of a moral battle there too, because these tenants have been living in economic obsoleteness for decades. And so it's a very big surprise to when they find out, oh, the market rent is actually four times what I've been paying for the last 10 years. And because they've been okay with paying that, they haven't made any advances to their personal life or their personal finances to be able to afford that. And then you have a homeless problem, right? So it's a big kind of melting pot. But yeah, the operations of California is kind of what makes the deal challenging for it to pencil.
Are you typically looking for your workforce housing, your maybe B class or maybe C class, assets where there's a, value add, 100%, classic interior, full renovation scope? Is that typically the types of assets that you're looking to take under contract?
I would say yes, more focus on the C and even D properties. Um, but the real gems are the ones that have value add and additional development potential on the back end. Because that's where our state's going with all of the, restrictions that we have on supply and all the increasing demand. If you can find a value add property that you can pull your capital out or your at least your working capital in 3 to 5 years, but then be able to add value to that on a developmental play 5 to 10 years down the road, those are pretty big. Here in San Diego locally, I mean, I have one friend that he just closed on a single family home in North Park, and he's gonna turn that into 42 units in the next 36 months. Which that is the reality that we're living in this particular environment. Up in Central California, that's not as much of a developmental play. There, it's more of the traditional value add. Like, let's get these 1950s furnishings updated and get market rents. But yeah, here in Southern California, it's all about the ADU play and the developmental play.
So I know that you don't have a crystal ball, neither do I. And I know that real estate is always local. So as it relates to the local market that you're in today, where do you expect real estate? What do you expect real estate to do maybe within the next year or two?
I expect it to stay stagnant. I expect all of these buyers to take more than a year to kind of being able to get things under contract in a sense that they pencil. There's always a lot of talk about interest rates and stuff like that, but I think of human nature as a whole. Even if interest rates came down a little bit and caused the properties um, to be easier to pencil, that inflation, that extreme amount of inflation and artificial values that we experienced for a few years, that's going to take a long time to be forgotten. And there's going to be a lot of sellers that they're going to have this number in their head, or they're going to be in a position where they don't have to sell, which again is a lot of times I hear about all of this floating rate debt and all of these deals that are going to come to market. But I'm a little guy. I don't have $20 million dollars to go pick up this really ginormous heck of a deal. I'm still on the lower end. And so for me, I'm not going to be affected by that as much. But even in my own personal homeowner, I know that my home has lost about 7% of value in the last 90 days. Do I care? No. But I think 90 days ago, I had 7% more equity in this property than I do now. And that's going to take quite a bit for me to kind of come down off my high horse, if you know what I mean. So I think as a whole, in the next 12 months, I can see that the market staying almost where it is. Maybe it is going to increase a little bit from a buyer perspective. But I think as a whole that we're gonna be in this cycle for a little bit longer.
Yeah, absolutely. What, Peter, what would be next up on your bucket list to complete?
Next up on my bucket list would be to complete an acquisition of a 5 and up unit. If that's what you were referring to, yeah. I mean, I am just so focused on I've had so many properties fall out of contract for artificially high prices or just couldn't come to an agreement on terms because I will give the sellers their price. If you can meet me on the terms, I will give you your price. I have no issue with doing that. But a lot of these mom and pop sellers, they're not used to things like seller carry and like all of these like long drawn out repositioning periods. But if I can get an asset that has, say, a 24 to a 36-month balloon seller carry at a lower rate just to make the numbers work, I'll go on that all day.
Would you do my audience a favor and explain to us what the phrase seller carry means?
Yeah, seller carry is literally the seller is acting as the bank. So, take for example, a seller owns a property free and clear. Instead of you going to the bank to get a loan, the seller is basically going to give you a loan. Maybe you'll give the seller a 10, 20, 30, 50% down payment, what have you. But the seller is then going to act as the bank. So, you'll be making payments to the seller and they will still hold title to the property. So you don't actually own the property until you pay them off. There's so many benefits to it. One, the seller can keep the same or greater cash flow than they were previously getting from the renters, so that can be enticing to them. Operationally and from both a responsible and a physical perspective, they're operationally not tied to the property anymore, but they still own the note to the property. So, and again, every seller is different. Some sellers they want nothing to do with the property, even if again, just the idea of them being tied to it stresses them out, which is why they're trying to get rid of it. So maybe that doesn't work. But even if the seller has debt on the property and they're willing to go in second position behind the bank, or your capital stack looks like the bank's going to lend on 70%, the seller's going to lend on 20%, and you're going to come with the 10%, or you're going to pull that 10% from an investor. There's so many different ways to skin the cat, which can also be a little bit of analysis paralysis to someone that's learning all of these terms and things from the get go. But just remember, a purchase sale agreement is a blank piece of paper, and you can put the ink on it, and you're in full control of what that ink says. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. What would be maybe one or two book or podcast recommendations that you would make to somebody that is maybe interested in getting into actively managing a duplex, a fourplex, 10 plus unit, property?
I would say, man, what was that podcast? Coach Carson, I think is his name. He's a North Carolina investor. he was really good when I was starting out at just laying the base level. Like, it did not go into depth. It was a very high level overview of all these different ways to invest in real estate. And I would basically use his podcast to look at myself and say, okay, this and this thing sound interesting to me. And then I'm going to go dive down those rabbit holes to find out more. Because when you're just starting out, right, analysis paralysis and shiny object syndrome are the bane of anybody's forward progress. And it really hurts any of their action taking that they could potentially take. So all of these meetups I go to, if I'm meeting a new person, I say, hey, if you want my advice, find a mentor or find someone that you can call to just give you an unbiased opinion to help you move forward. If you're getting stuck, pick up the damn phone and call someone. Stop scrolling on the internet. Just pick up the phone. And that's just my only thing to, and so for me starting out, he was my unofficial mentor, right? I think his name is Coach Carson. And that was a really kind of base level podcast. And then books, I wasn't really into reading. I am now, but back when I was learning, I didn't read any books. I didn't read Rich Dad Poor Dad until after my 4 unit. I didn't read, The Untethered Soul or Traction or any of these other, Cash Flow Quadrant, all these books that you hear over and over and over again. Yeah, I didn't read any of those until after I had done my first couple deals.
Right. You're more on the take action and kind of figure it out later
Yeah.
spectrum. I've share that same sentiment myself as well. That I'm happy to make a mess and then figure out a way to clean it up or beg for forgiveness later. All those kind of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think you and I are probably wired, very much in the same way. So we'll definitely put that podcast that you gave a shout out to in the show notes. I've really appreciated, having you on here today with us, Peter. What would be a couple of different ways that our audience can reach out to you to learn more about what you're up to?
I would say call me, text me, like get in touch, right? I mean, my direct phone number is 707-489-6236. That's my direct line. And I don't care if you spam me because it's so easy to block those callers nowadays. But yeah, if you're feeling stuck or want to get into it, reach out. Would love to hear from you. And my Instagram is also where I post a lot of stories on my day-to-day building of operations and things like that. And that's simply my first and last name at Peter Eberhardt. You can also follow me on there. And yeah, would anybody that's listening to this, you're never going to meet a true real estate investor that discourages you from getting into real estate. For a bazillion different reasons, it's the best thing that you can do. So take action, crush it, become the person you want to become. And over time, you'll find those people that will help you get there.
Peter, with that, thank you again for joining the show.
I appreciate it, Jeremy.
Yeah, and Freedom Point podcast listeners, we thank you again for joining another episode of the Freedom Point. Look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.